So welcome. So the recording will stop just before the question and answer time, and it will be sent to all the registered participants. So you'll receive that after the presentation. So again, my name is Erin Navarro, pronouns she and her, and I'll be presenting developing volunteer positions today. Just some housekeeping first. So we ask that everyone remains muted throughout the presentation. You're welcome to take yourself off mute at the end when there's question and answer times. But any questions you have or comments before then, you can type into the chat. And my manager, Graham Dearden, manager of learning and resources, will be able to answer any questions you have throughout the presentation. And with that, we will get started with a land affirmation. So, Volunteer Alberta's main office is situated on Treaty 6 territory, specifically Amiskwaciy-Waskagan, as it is referred to by the Plains Cree peoples, among other Indigenous names, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I am currently joining you from Treaty 7 territory. So our staff, board, and our work reach across treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10, and we affirm that the land we call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory, as well as present-day homes of many nations, including the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Kainai, Piikani, and Siksika, the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, Stoney Nakoda, and the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Métis people of Alberta, which includes the Métis settlements and the 21 districts of the Métis Nations of Alberta. And since time immemorial, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples have cared for these lands, and they continue to do so today. So Volunteer Alberta identifies and affirms the historical and current relationships of these nations to the land as an act of reconciliation, and with the awareness that acknowledging, recognizing, or affirming these facts is a small step and it is not enough. But Volunteer Alberta is committed to reflecting on, critiquing, and changing our ways of knowing, being, and doing in order to start supporting and concretely contributing to reconciliation and Indigenous resurgence in ways that we have not yet done. So in the context of developing volunteer positions today, we all have the opportunity to consider the barriers that Indigenous people have faced historically as well as presently when it comes to exclusionary policies. And as nonprofits in Alberta and in the spirit of reconciliation, we have a responsibility to consider how our organizations can contribute to inclusive, accessible, and equitable volunteer programming. So this presentation today is from the Volunteer Screening Program, or VSP. And VSP is a partnership between Volunteer Alberta and the Government of Alberta, and we provide educational resources and tools designed to help the nonprofit voluntary sector organizations improve their volunteer screening processes and procedures. So we also offer financial opportunities to aid organizations in their volunteer screening efforts, and that includes the Vulnerable Sector Check Fee Waiver and Volunteer Screening Development Grants. So when we're talking about volunteer screening or just screening, we're very broadly describing the relationship between volunteers and organizations and just defining what that looks like. So it's a very big topic. It encompasses a lot of subtopics too, like what we're talking about today, but all of them collectively aim to improve the quality and safety of programs and services in our communities. And lastly, please understand that Volunteer Alberta does not provide legal advice in this webinar, and our resources will provide some useful and general information. But any concerns specific to your work, you should bring to a legal professional. So this webinar today will focus on volunteer positions and how to develop them. So this is a common topic that we often receive questions about, and especially as it relates to an organization's volunteer recruitment efforts. So as we go through this presentation today, we'll address volunteer recruitment trends and how to develop mutually beneficial position descriptions that support volunteers in feeling valued and engaged within your organizations. So we're going to go through the key aspects of a role description, and then how it informs aspects of screening. And then when well-crafted and informative, so volunteer positions are absolutely another avenue for recruiting and retaining great volunteers. And we'll also talk about today how they're really a part of the nonprofit human resources process, and they really should be treated as the same as paid positions. So we'll talk more about that as well. So a guiding framework that is important to let you know this is how we're approaching this topic is through this definition of relationship-based screening. And this is where screening practices emphasize human connection, empathy, and mutual understanding. And relationship-based screening goes beyond collecting personal documents, as it welcomes volunteers to participate and be equal players in the volunteer screening process, while organizations create safe and welcoming volunteer programming to promote volunteerism. So that is our approach to the presentation today, as well as many of the aspects that and learning resources that the volunteer screening program provides. So when we're talking about crafting volunteer positions, we're going to start with mission and vision. So obviously this isn't something you're developing for a volunteer position, but it's something that every nonprofit should already have. And it's important to communicate because many volunteers want to give their time and effort to a cause they believe in. So it's good to just include that right in the position. So even if there's other motivations to volunteer, such as gaining work experience or improving a skill, it's still important to note that mission and vision provide the volunteer with very crucial information to the role. So tell them what your organization does, the basic idea of your work in a memorable sentence or two. And it is also something that you can continue to note in interviews or meet and greets or in a welcome email or in your volunteer handbook. And repeating the mission and vision does help to keep the volunteer on track with the tasks that they complete, and it also helps them to know that it does contribute. All that they do does contribute to an end goal. So the project or position describes the goal of the role itself and how it does contribute to the overall mission. So this is where you can talk broadly about the position, what it means, why it exists, etc. And a lot of the specifics of the position are going to be built out in other sections. So this is more a summary of the purpose of the role. Tasks describe exactly what you want the volunteer to do, and so you can list specific tasks and responsibilities that the role will encompass. And so when we talk about tasks, it's really best to stick to specific and measurable ones. And a volunteer will be looking at this information to determine what they will actually be doing. So abstract or nebulous tasks isn't necessarily going to help them understand what they will be doing. And an example of that, of a specific task, could be the volunteer will be present at the yearly fundraising gala to assist in setup and teardown. But an abstract version of that might be the volunteer will assist in fundraising operations. And that could potentially mean endless tasks. So when you're considering the tasks themselves, what they will be doing, this is a good time to try connecting each task to the mission and vision during the internal discussions with your team around the position development. So you could ask, do the tasks contribute and relate to the overall mission of the organization? And so if it's difficult for you and your team to find a connection between the task and the mission, then it might also be worthwhile to reconsider the task or even perhaps the necessity of the role itself. The next thing to include is skills. So skills can both be hard skills such as writing or website development, or soft skills such as customer service and communication. Regardless, though, distinguish between skills that are going to be required and need to have for the job and those that are a nice to have. So some volunteers look to develop their skills through volunteer roles. And good practice is to remain open and flexible to potentially training someone to fit certain skills if they do not already have them, but are willing to learn. And so one way you could communicate skill development in a job description is emphasizing that the list of skills shows what will be developed while they complete the role. So one of the resources that we offer is this fun activity that can help you determine what's required and what might be nice to have. So this is our window of work, and it's a simple grid to help identify what a person might want out of their work. And this is something that you can adapt to use in a volunteer application, for example, or it's something that you can work through with a volunteer just to see where they're at with certain skills, and then to also help with matching them to a fulfilling role. So that is our window of work. And all the resources I'll also mention that I'll talk about in this webinar, I'll send out to all the registered participants as well. So you'll be getting a hefty email with all of the resources that I talk about. So setting describes where the volunteer will work. So it could be outdoors, your main office, virtually, out in the community, but it's good to mention where they will be going. And it's also going to highlight who the volunteer will be working with and the clients or people they'll be engaging or serving in their role. So this could read like the volunteer will be working outside in a public setting with numerous other volunteers and program participants. So again, volunteer positions is about just communicating what you do know, just to start building that trust, credibility, and that relationship with volunteers. Schedule and time commitment is where you're going to answer common questions like how long will the job last? How many hours per week? Can the volunteer determine their own hours? And is the position flexible? Is the job more time intensive during certain months of the year? And are there any date specific events or project deadlines part of the job? So this is where you can give a volunteer an understanding of the length of time they will spend with your organization and the commitment required to fulfill the role. So every position is going to be a bit different. So a volunteer might come in with mismatched expectations if this part isn't clear or communicated properly. And stating time commitment can really also help to narrow down your screening to potential candidates who can commit to that schedule, as well as help with engagement and retention, since volunteers who are properly informed before they start a volunteer role does help with engagement and retention over the long run. And that also will build credibility for your organization as well. So training and supervision are also great ways to highlight who the volunteer reports to and the type of feedback they can expect within the role. So this is also a great time to connect volunteers with other team members and other volunteers. And this is where you can emphasize the inherently relational aspect of good volunteer screening practice. So during a training or orientation, you might want to reference back to their interview or application and make notes of how certain tasks will relate to their own goals. Again, tasks that are listed out in the volunteer description. And ultimately, training is a time to continue building that trust between you, the organization, and the volunteer. Again, one that is mutually beneficial and rooted in respect. So to increase retention and also mitigate risk, it's ideal that the volunteers have some kind of relationship with the volunteer specialist or those who are doing the supervision. Again, so they know who they can direct their questions and concerns to. So while trainings and supervision are most often not included in the public posting, it's just great to include in at least your internal documents as a reference to other policies, processes, and procedures that link directly to that volunteer position. Good practice is to describe upfront any required background checks or screening tests for volunteers. And just by highlighting what a volunteer can expect from the screening process right at the beginning, this is where you set clear expectations and timelines for when the volunteer will officially start, what the recruitment process entails, and it also opens the door to conversation about any obstacles or challenges the volunteer may have with the screening process. So note that certain aspects of screening, like background checks and references, can present more of a barrier, especially for equity deserving groups. And good practice would be to balance the level of screening with the level of risk that is inherent to this volunteer role. And so if you're interested in looking at how to assess that risk, you can look at our previous webinar. I'll also send the link. It's called Developing Policy and Managing Risk. Just to explore more on how to assess risk and then also to balance it with the appropriate level of screening, just to be mindful of how we can unintentionally create barriers for volunteer engagement. But again, it's about communicating it clearly and effectively just right at the beginning to manage some of those expectations and just to give the information that you do have. And lastly, at the end of 2022, the volunteer screening program conducted a survey asking volunteers about equity and inclusion in their roles. So they were asked if they were ever given the opportunity to provide feedback to organizations, and 83% of those volunteers said that they were never asked to provide feedback. So again, in the spirit of equity and inclusion, it's important to be listening for feedback. And this could be added to something like a job description description. Like, for example, you could have a line that explains there will be quarterly or biannual surveys asking for their feedback, or that they can direct it to their supervisor, and explain how that relates to the mission. Because it's likely that pursuing your mission and vision is somewhat reliant on volunteer labor. And so creating a safe volunteer program is an important part of the organization's work and overall mission and vision. This is also where you can explain that their supervisor is someone they can direct their feedback to, how that works. You can outline any processes you have for collecting and acting on feedback. And so one thing I did as a volunteer coordinator was I would just upfront say to them that after your first shift, I'm going to call you and email you just to ask how it went. And so those are just some ideas for inclusion and equity in a volunteer position. And although there are potentially endless opportunities to include this in a position description, one example could be, could the position description be translated into other languages? Is it written in plain language? And is it formatted so that it is accessible to read? And then also in accordance with good practice around privacy, which we'll also talk more about in a later slide, you can also just state how the volunteer's information will be used, who has access to it to ensure safety. That is both felt and real for the volunteer. So now we're going to go into each section as with an example. And so in this position description, the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, this is a position description that was borrowed from Volunteer Connector when we first did this presentation a couple of years ago, but they're looking for a volunteer who would like to engage in combat-oriented video games such as Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter with a participant in the Vision Mate program. So when taking a look at this description here, you'll see some key information come out as to just to give the volunteer an idea of what the position entails beyond just helping the organization. What does that look like exactly? And so this description can actually be fleshed out quite a bit, but for our purposes, we've left it short. And this is also where you can use, this is the space to summarize the volunteer position as a whole too. So it can be a few sentences long. It just depends on the position itself and what you want to communicate. So under tasks, it says there will be one-to-one mentorship and support, providing companionship to people in community with programming such as reading, art, or other creative activities. So this is where we get into tasks. Again, this section can include a lot more information, but an example that could be included involves the other work the volunteer does in addition to the portion of the role focused on gaming in this example. So yeah, they'll game, but also they can help program participants engage in other activities as they're working in kind of a mentorship role. And so under skills, they're looking for someone with experience with Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, or other related video games. And they're looking for someone friendly and outgoing. And so this is where we really make this seem like a job description. And this is where you should treat these volunteer positions like job descriptions. Overall, you should be doing that. And this information should be readily available and done in advance of sending out this position description, just as a form of planning and transparency and good practice to be able to communicate what the volunteer can expect. So the setting is one-to-one at a program space or in the community like a local library. And so as you can see here, the setting is laid out pretty readily. And volunteers looking at volunteer positions might just assume the volunteer work has to be done at the organization's physical space. But as most of you know, that's not always true. I'm working from my home right now. And so this is a chance for you to think about whether or not your volunteers need to be in your physical location. Is there a possibility for your work to be done remotely? And so this is something really important to think about and also to communicate, just as so many people more and more are working from home. And so what work do your volunteers do that could be done from home, like your employees who do work from home? So it's good practice just to explain that in plain language as much as possible, because there might be different expectations of what that could look like. Schedule and time commitment. This is a big one because mismatched expectations can often be generated right here. So this role is asking once a week for a minimum of 1 year. So if a volunteer comes in expecting to be doing 1 to 2 hours every couple weeks, but you're actually expecting them to be doing 3 to 4 hours every week, this can result in a volunteer becoming frustrated and leaving or burning out, or simply not engaging, even if you've gone through half of the screening process with them. So just be clear on the amount of work right from the start, and then also you can continue to clarify as you have interviews or meet and greets or other conversations with volunteers. So as you can see in the example here, under training and supervision, it says they'll report to the volunteer manager, and there will also be quarterly check-ins with the volunteer and the client just to determine how the match is working. So this outlines where the volunteer fits into the organizational structure. So laying out that the volunteer reports to the volunteer manager and regularly has opportunities for check-ins and evals might also make the volunteer feel more confident in applying for a particular position, because no one wants to be stuck in a situation where they can't tell if they're performing their duties correctly, especially if they're working towards some goal, either personally or professionally. Just offering that time to show how their growth is doing, and if you can support as a volunteer manager, how you can support them in meeting their goals. Under screening, this role includes an interview, a reference check, police information check with the vulnerable sector check. So this lays out clearly what the volunteer can expect. And sometimes volunteers see screening as barriers, and sometimes they are, just because they want to start volunteering as soon as possible. So laying out screening can be done in advance, and it's just in an effort to manage expectations too. Again, that clear communication, just leaving that line of communication open, again, so that expectations are managed and as clear as possible. So now we have a clear idea of what we mean when we say volunteer position and what that can look like. But there's certain topics that orbit around developing volunteer position descriptions. So we're going to start with talking about organizations' responsibilities with respect to the law. So when looking at human resources from a screening perspective, and volunteer positions is definitely a part of human resources, we are most often concerned with questions related to volunteers and the law, which can include: when are volunteers deemed employees under the law? When are volunteers treated as employees of an organization? And are organizations viewed as employers of volunteers? And what does this mean in terms of their relationship and obligations to each other? And do volunteers have the same rights and protections as paid employees? So legislation does vary from one area of law and jurisdiction to another. So it can be difficult to find consistent answers to these questions. But as organizations, we need to know which social policies and legislation govern our actions and volunteer engagement at various different levels: federally, provincially, municipally, and organizationally. So this slide just highlights some of those key areas for consideration when looking at provincial contexts. And I'll note, though, that as I have many times during this series already and in previous webinars, again, if you have questions about legislation, policies, or legal considerations, please consult with a legal professional, as Volunteer Alberta does not offer legal advice. So under provincial legislation, we have the occupational health and safety legislation. And under OH&S law, volunteers are considered employees. So while volunteers have always been considered workers under OH&S, the government of Alberta updated the legislation in 2018, and just to clarify the definition of worker. It now includes students, both practicum and interns. So volunteers and students that perform or supply services for no monetary compensation or as part of their learning activities have all the rights and all the obligations of workers as described in OHS regulations and code here in Alberta. And organizations which employ volunteers or students are subject to all the employer obligations under Alberta's OHS legislation. So for more information, I'll also be sending a link to their website that outlines OHS here in Alberta. So next, when we're looking at human resources and volunteers, there are a multitude of different policies that can impact your hiring, your screening, and your recruitment efforts. So provincially and nationally, there are some common policies and legislations that we should consider as part of human resources: human rights legislation and information and privacy legislation. So human rights is the one area of legislation that is most consistently applied to volunteers and paid staff across jurisdictions. And so the legislation prohibits discrimination on the basis of a number of factors such as age, sex, religion, gender, culture, disability, sexual orientation, or record of offenses. So volunteering is seen as a public service as well as employment. So when it comes to human rights, volunteers have the exact same rights as paid staff. And for many organizations, respecting privacy is the law. So the mishandling of personal information can lead to serious consequences for an organization and the individuals involved. So good privacy practice is just a key part of accountability and risk management in a nonprofit organization. So to help you manage the information you collect and create during the screening process, there are 3 pieces of legislation that exist here in Alberta: the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, the Personal Information Protection Act, and the Health Information Act. So most nonprofits are governed by the Personal Information and Protection Act, or PIPA. So you may be subject to the other legislations if you have contracts or programs in partnership with the government of Alberta or your municipal government or Alberta Health. And moving on to organizational responsibility. So lastly, just consider what the legal responsibilities are for the board. So once elected, a board of directors assumes responsibility for the affairs of the whole organization. So together, nonprofit boards and directors owe a duty of care and are accountable to program participants, to volunteers, to other board members, to staff, to members of the organization, and the general public who may be affected by the programs and services of the organization. So again, that's a lot of information, but the recording will be sent to all registered attendees. So the HR process as it relates to volunteer screening, there's often a misconception that human resources for volunteers is different from HR for paid employees, but that's not the case. In fact, the same human resource practices apply regardless of whether you're looking to onboard a volunteer or a paid employee. So in both cases, you're looking for the right fit with the organization, with the role itself, with the all the people involved, and just ensuring that you've matched the person, the volunteer, with a fulfilling position that's based on their skills, their interests, and their abilities. The next thing to consider is how often to update a job description. And the description is typically updated each time it's being posted. But with the frequency for nonprofits who look for volunteers, this is an unrealistic expectation, which we understand. So we would recommend good practice is to update whenever there has been significant updates to the scope of duties or the position itself, or whenever there's been significant changes to the program or the organization. And then we recommend updating position descriptions once a year on a schedule. And then this also provides a great opportunity to check in with current volunteers who are doing the work and to just learn from their perspective what they think about it. And they can tell you then what skills or abilities are absolutely going to be required, or which ones that definitely helps them improve upon in the role itself, what they enjoy about it, what they would say to other people about the position, and even what they recommend as potential changes to the structure of the position. So it's also good practice to run a risk assessment of the role whenever you do update it. And more on how to assess risk can be viewed in our previous webinar, Developing Policy and Managing Risk. I'll send the link. It's also on our resources page. And then also lastly, we recommend considering the current trends that are impacting volunteerism and volunteer engagement, which we will move to next. So what are volunteers interested in? I'm sure this is obvious to many of you, but people volunteer differently now than they did 50 years ago, 25 years ago, or even just a few years ago, pre-pandemic. And since the world is increasingly mobile and we have lovely little rectangles in our pockets that are fighting for our attention, as well as multiple screens on our desks, this changes how we engage with volunteers and how we as volunteers engage with organizations. So some volunteer motivations include positions that are project-based or episodic or short-term. So volunteers aren't always super interested in lifetime commitments or longer-term commitments. And these short-term volunteer opportunities might be more interesting just because it lends to flexibility and the ever-changing scenarios of our life where we have to switch jobs or move or something else comes up. It just helps with that flexibility. They're also looking for results-driven roles. So I'll mention again that the tasks that you do should be linked directly to your mission and vision, because they want to know exactly the impact they will have on their community and how their role will support the mission of the organization. And they also might want to build skills for their resume or meet their own goals for self-fulfillment and self-actualization. So they're looking to meet their own goals as well in the roles and how that role will support them in their own journeys. So volunteers increasingly also want positions that embrace their own individual interests and motivations and passions, just like any other job. So again, a volunteer would prefer to do work that aligns with their interests, just as you would with a career choice or a job that you're interested in. So volunteers are also looking for skills-based opportunities that support advancement personally and professionally. And sometimes it's difficult to talk about personal or professional benefits to volunteering, just because sometimes there's this narrative that volunteers are just there to give, and benefit the community. However, volunteering should absolutely and can be mutually beneficial for the community, the organization, and for the volunteer. And so this reflects that relationship-based screening approach that I talked about, which positively affects organizations, the volunteers and the participants, and the broader community. But it can be helpful when developing volunteer positions just to be upfront about what the volunteer wants to gain from volunteering, what their goals are, what they hope to achieve, and just to offer in the position what they will gain, whether it be skills or community mentorship, or if you provide references for jobs or other volunteer roles. And it just helps clarify those motivations, and then to also plan activities based on those motivations. So we also know that volunteers are engaging with their roles differently. So volunteers, again, are looking for those flexible opportunities that fit their ever-changing schedules, and it's more and more appealing to volunteer around this flexible schedule that doesn't have fixed days, for example. So gigging together work and different short-term opportunities is just becoming more common, and it's becoming harder and harder to have particular times every week, month, or year to volunteer. And also 21st century volunteers also like informal or even virtual opportunities. So this is an opportunity to look at your volunteer roles and consider what could possibly be virtual. And also volunteers are interested in starting positions right away. And so the research that we've seen is that in Alberta, this can be a huge barrier to engagement, just because volunteer positions can take a long time to get started in. So the screening process, absolutely incredibly important, and it can take a long time to go through. And so there's that trade-off in volunteer engagement when factoring in the amount of time that screening can take. So this is a time to consider that screening for particular positions should be adapted to also factor in the impact it has on volunteer engagement. And again, in our previous webinar, we talk about balancing the level of risk in the role with the level of screening. So it doesn't mean that every volunteer has to go through the same level of screening, and that might improve their pathway to engaging with your organization. So who are Alberta's volunteers? The profile of an urban volunteer in the greater metro areas tend to be mid-30s, and they're often newcomers looking to build their language skills, or they're individuals transitioning between careers or education and the workforce. And so they want opportunities that enhance their skills and enhance their abilities. And these volunteers tend to gravitate towards more episodic, informal, and group volunteer opportunities that they can do with their families and their friends. So again, they're still looking for organizations with meaningful missions that resonate with them and ones that they can contribute to. Rural volunteers, however, tend to be early 50s, and they tend to volunteer weekly and often for multiple different causes. But the primary motivation in these cases is more of a desire to support and better the community. And they tend to look for longer term opportunities and are more formal in their volunteer roles. And in general, they find opportunities through word of mouth, social network, and community organizations where they know the people there. But again, this is slightly older research that I think can absolutely help us be attuned to volunteer engagement, but just also be aware that as time goes on, there will be more and more research about volunteer engagement in a post-lockdown world. And just to keep your ears and your mind open to how that could potentially look different. And that might mean we need to pivot the way that we write our volunteer positions and engage with the volunteers, and how we screen volunteers. So on the flip side, why aren't people volunteering? Firstly, that they might not have time. And this is especially common in younger volunteers who may work regular hours and shift work and gig a bunch of different roles together and multiple jobs. So it's hard to commit to volunteering when your schedule is up in the air. Nobody asks them. And so this can seem a bit odd, just because perhaps you feel like you're constantly asking people to volunteer, but it's just a common issue that we see among potential volunteers. And they know that nonprofit orgs exist in their communities, but sometimes the calls don't always make it to them. And it can also just be really hard to know where to start when you just see like a bulletin board full of volunteer roles, and it's like, I don't even know where to start. So one way we talk about recruiting volunteers is start with the volunteers that are engaged. They are your greatest recruitment force. So you can ask them to ask their friends and family to engage in perhaps a group-centered volunteer activity. And that's a place where you could make that initial contact and see if there's perhaps a good fit for the organization and for the potential volunteer to get engaged. Another one is that they don't see the impact of what they're doing. And I've hinted at this earlier when talking about those tasks and how they relate to the mission. Volunteers are passionate people, and they want to see their passion put to work, and they want to see the results and to know what story that they are ultimately a part of, which could be your mission and vision of your organization. So this positive feedback loop and keeping those channels of communication open generates future volunteers. And it's another reason why making mission-oriented tasks is very important. And then to also communicate that to them why their tasks do make an impact. They also don't necessarily know where to go to find meaningful volunteer opportunities. And again, sometimes people just don't know where to start. We can go online, look for volunteer opportunities in my area, and it can be overwhelming to decide who they want to volunteer with and what they want to do. And that becomes a more complicated question. So perhaps if somebody does make their way to your organization, that's something that you can help and have a conversation with about, is just, what do you want to do? And so you can help with that and how you screen and how you ask questions, for example. There's also systemic barriers. So volunteers from equity deserving groups have been historically excluded from volunteering. And to create more inclusive volunteer programming, an intentional shift to inclusivity and equity is required through things like policy and culture, for example. But some of the more traditional steps of volunteering, in particular, making background checks mandatory and asking for references, can deter some groups. Again, groups who have been systemically targeted by law enforcement or perhaps they don't have a network available to reach out to provide a reference for them. And so when developing volunteer positions, it's just important to consider those different factors, those different circumstances of life, and just how you can promote volunteerism rather than prohibit it, especially from certain groups who have been systemically excluded from volunteering. And we also don't know. So in a post-lockdown world, we're still trying to understand how motivations may have changed in light of the pandemic. And that is why it's very important to ask for feedback from volunteers at your organization, and then be ready to adjust and be flexible and adapt when those new motivations come to light. There will likely be more information and research that comes out in the coming years that will also help us to understand how to engage with volunteers and the different motivations as well. So keep an eye and ear out for that. So traditionally, an organization will design the role. They'll see, like, we want somebody to come do this for us. They'll have the volunteer role, and then they'll recruit volunteers to fit into that role. So they need a position filled. They just want somebody to fill the role. So the volunteers who fill these roles are also tend to be more traditional volunteers usually. And these are the types of roles where, somebody shows up every Thursday to make evening meals for the drop-in meal. And these are the people who show up to your fundraising events year after year to do registration. And they're also the parents who volunteer on their kids' sports team. So perhaps these volunteers have not made a return to your organization after lockdowns. And to an extent, we all need these roles to continue. And for the most part, volunteers will continue to show up at your doorstep looking for volunteer roles and willing to do, the cooking and the coaching and the cleaning up registration. But in a lot of ways, this traditional volunteer position development approach can remove the human aspect from human resources, and often it doesn't yield the type of results we want. And these types of roles typically result in low engagement and high turnover, and then lack of drive. So with the relationship-based screening approach, this is where we can bring a human aspect back to the equation. So it's not just about filling the role, it's about finding the best fit for the role, the best fit for the organization, and the best fit for the people, including the volunteer, the participants, and the community members. So this is where the organization and the volunteer can mutually and collaboratively and co-create those volunteer roles that are flexible and adaptable. And so then in our organizations, we absolutely understand what the mission is, what our vision is, our values, the work that needs to be done, how we operate, our internal culture, like what our team, how our team works together, I should say, our personality. And we can think of the person that would be the best fit for the organization. And then, yeah, we can start actively recruiting from our network. But an alternative is that we design the role with flexibility in mind, with those positive feedback loops that are open for feedback and communication. And then we can also engage with volunteers and think about volunteers just as individuals with different skills, different abilities, ones that perhaps we've never even thought about could benefit the organization. And then also thinking about what the organization can nurture for the volunteer, whether that be certain goals that they have or skills that they want to explore. So for example, considering perhaps for the first time what parts of the role could be done virtually, that can open up the volunteer pool literally to a world of potential volunteers. So again, people engagement is about putting the human back in human resources, and it doesn't necessarily throw out old ways of doing, but it can bring a fresh approach that is different from, there's a warm bum in this chair now, we filled the role. So it can make people feel valued, and then it can also help with demonstrating the impact and foster this mutually beneficial relationship that is rooted in trust. And yeah, so one of the resources that the volunteer screening program offers is the volunteer position risk assessment and policy considerations, this template that you can use once you've kind of developed a volunteer position, or if you want to look back at some of your volunteer positions. So you might be losing track of how this all connects to screening, but to close this presentation out, This template includes a section to identify risk as well as policy as it relates to the position. And this is very much related to volunteer screening, because screening at its core is a form of risk management. So it's important to treat the position development process like a form of risk management. So how you structure your positions with respect to risk is a question you should be asking yourself during the entire position development process, when you're engaging with volunteers who are already in the role, when you're looking at the setting, the tasks, the skills, and so on. So screening envelops a lot of different processes, but when we make decisions based on risk and based on policy, we also make decisions that impact volunteer engagement and the volunteers themselves. So if you have screening processes that are applied the same way for every volunteer, I'd recommend you look at that again, because you may be creating unnecessary barriers for volunteers who engage in low risk positions or short-term positions. And again, I'll send you this resource in the follow-up email. So it's also easy for volunteer managers to feel like the volunteer positions in an organization just exist and it's their job to fill them. But if we're nimble, flexible organizations that are actively working to improve community safety and volunteer engagement, it is important to think about volunteer positions as something that can be changed and altered depending on many different circumstances. And an example that I could give to you right now is from a position that the VSP team reviewed at an earlier date for the vulnerable sector check fee waiver. So this organization had a number of volunteer positions throughout their organization. All of them dealt with various levels of risk, and they had a theater to present some programming and some volunteers who helped vulnerable people viewing their programming. And some didn't help with directly with the vulnerable people viewing their programming. But they did have one particular position. It was a reception volunteer, and 95% of their responsibilities were low risk, publicly visible. They were supervised, like taking coats, directing people to washrooms, setting up, tearing down, cleaning up. But then they also had a task with taking seniors with mobility issues to the theater through a back entrance unsupervised. Now the risk increases. And so it was required for them to regularly be responsible for the safety of vulnerable people in a private setting. So even though there were plenty of other volunteers who already supported vulnerable people in the organization and could be doing this task, this reception volunteer would have to go through the same amount of screening as the other roles, as someone being screened with a high level of risk, even though 95% of their role was low risk. It was because of this one task. So if that task was perhaps given to another role, then this position would be structured differently in terms of screening. So since the screening should be flexible to the level of risk, if that task was moved to somewhere else, then the level of screening doesn't have to be as intense necessarily. And so then the responsibilities involved in this position could then match and balance with the level of screening that was perhaps a few less steps. Again, that's one avenue to increase engagement, just to reduce screening if and when possible, and also safe to do so. So when we talk about volunteerism, it becomes related to volunteer screening, and the skills required for certain roles becomes related to volunteer screening too, because it all has to do with assessing how you can deploy volunteers based on various pieces of information. So when you send volunteers out into a volunteer position with certain skills, how you have structured that position will still play a role in your individual and organizational duty of care. Again, one that can affect, increase or decrease volunteer engagement. So this template here is a free resource on our resource page, and it's something that after you go through kind of an evaluation of the volunteer position description, the skills, the tasks, and so on, this is something that you can look at and go, okay, how can we address certain risks through things like policy? You're also welcome to visit the volunteer screening program page for more about the vulnerable sector check fee waiver, the screening development grant, and you can also click on our resources tab to look at some of the other resources that we have on there for you. And I'm very excited to announce you're the first group to hear about it, that we have an upcoming webinar series titled Equity and Inclusion in Volunteer Screening. And so this is just based off some of the research that we're seeing from the community conversations that we've been having, and the feedback that we've received as well. That this is an area of volunteer screening that is interesting and needed, and there's a hope to talk more about what this could look like for volunteer screening. So we'll be starting off the webinar series with volunteer rights, for what volunteers and board members need to know, what responsibilities they have, how they're protected by legislation and law. So I'll be sending the registration link. You can send that out to your board, to any volunteers that you have. We're very excited about this, and just to learn more about the protective measures that volunteers have. As well as on February 27th, we have the goals-based approach to screening, so how to nourish relationships and trust in volunteer programming. So you can join us to learn more about how to create adaptable and flexible screening, and we'll be offering some ways that you can contextualize screening to meet the needs of your community members as well as your volunteers and your organization in an adaptable and flexible approach. So we're very excited for that. And then we'll be ending with engaging newcomers, welcoming newcomers to participate in volunteerism. And this is where you can learn more about newcomers, how their motivations might be a bit different, and how to support them in their goals and engage them in your volunteer programming. All of these are on Tuesday, January 16th, Tuesday in February, and then Tuesday in March from 11 a.m. to 12:15 p.m. And they are all free. So we'd love to see you there. So if you have any questions about the presentation today and you want to continue the conversation, you're more than welcome to email us at screening@volunteeralberta.ab.ca. We also offer free coaching to nonprofits in Alberta who are interested in learning more about volunteer screening. Or if you'd like to continue, again, this conversation, you're more than welcome to get in contact with us. And you can access our resources from our resource library as well. And then all registered participants will be receiving the recording and all the mentioned resources, and we'll also include a follow-up survey. And we'd really deeply appreciate it if you take the time to share your feedback so we can continue to create and share meaningful presentations that support you in your work. So with that, I'm just going to stop the recording and then we'll move to our question and answer time.